New Buddhaware Dhamma Talks. Geoff Hunt presents a talk on some aspect of the Buddha's teaching.
What happens when something gets hold of you? So you're, in that sense, you're not the master of it, but you could become the master of it. Obviously, the idea of being a master of anything has got its own limitations because it does sound very controlling, but let's just go with that for a moment. It doesn't mean master in the sense of master and slave or something like that. It means master as in master musician. Okay, so let me see. Anger, irritation, frustration, jealousy, indignation. Now, there are fruitful ones, there are positive ones, but I'm just talking about the negative ones for the moment. There's a whole range of things: fear, anxiety, disappointment, feeling let down, betrayal, feeling betrayed, grief, lusting after someone that perhaps you shouldn't, hatred, impatience. So when the carpenter is trying to make a figure of something, a statue, a statuette or whatever, he'll make mistakes, he'll slip, or the head will come off the statue that he was just it's a start all over again, which is okay. Start all over again. Start afresh every time. Okay, just imagine now then, take this analogy a step further, that just as we've got hands that can do all sorts of things, imagine that somehow in your mind you've got a pair of hands, right? And what it's doing is shaping your mind, turning it this way, turning it that way. Saying, no, not that way, that way. That way's going to cause damage, go that way. Right? Until it becomes intuitive. A pair of hands in your mind. Right. First of all, there's the word remember or recollect. And it's interesting that the word usually translated as mindfulness is sati, S-A-T-I, not sati, but sati. And sati literally means to recollect. It doesn't mean, we've translated it as mindfulness because if you're mindful of something, in a way you've remembered it. It's coming to your attention, you see? But the real root is connected with that idea of recollecting something. So to be mindful of even ordinary things around you, it's like, don't knock into the table, there's a cup on there. You're remembering that there is a cup on the table, don't knock into it. It's a pity that we've lost that route because it's the very first step in following the skill that the Buddha is trying to impart to us, is to remember that it is in your mind that the work needs to be done and not in somebody else's mind or anything external. Now, that's not to say to totally ignore the world out there, but we just come to that later. We've got to sort ourselves out, get our own seatbelt on before we can deal with other people's seatbelts, okay? So, just remember that. So the very first step is to remember where this anger or jealousy or anxiety is located. It's not on the floor. It's not flapping about in the sky. It's not carried about in somebody's handbag. It's not in your bank account. It's in your mind. And you've got a pair of hands that can actually reshape this. So the very first step is to recollect where this arising is arising, where this frustration or this dissatisfaction, this disappointment, this craving for something, you know not what, where is it? It's so easy to make somebody else responsible for it, isn't it? That's what we tend to do, or say it's our circumstances. Well, of course, it's not that that's totally false. It's just not a very good starting point. You know, one hears so many of us grumbling about our husbands, our wives, our children, our partners, or my father, my mother, my manager, etc., etc., etc. And if there is a difficulty in that area, it's because they're suffering exactly the same sorts of things that you're suffering. So we're all going round and round in circles, chasing our own tails. We're talking about the right place to start. The right place to start is to remember where the issue is. It's in your own mind. If you can't take that step, then we can't proceed at all. We'll just be back to, say, blaming others. Is it an easy step to take? What do you think? Is that an easy step to take? Because I see myself doing it, still doing it. It's your fault. Or why was I treated in that way? Well, that's not the way you do things. If only I could admit that I'm feeling disappointed, say, right? Then deal with that. Then I can go back to whatever that is with a bit more wisdom and compassion. So you just got to get things in the right order. If I start with seeing it as outside and then attack that, try and deal with that, I'm not approaching it with much wisdom or insight, because I haven't understood my own mind. Because I've got a pair of hands in there. Just need to know how to develop craftsmanship that the Buddha is talking about. So, number one, recollect where this negative arising is. Just remember that there are positive ones. I'm not neglecting them, I just can't do everything at once. Right? There are positive ones like joy, generosity, kindness, all the rest of it, which should be nurtured. Anyway, what is number two? Well, there is a word in Pali which is vichara. Vichara means, the nearest to it would be investigate. Right? It means, right, I'm now looking in the right place. At least I've got the location of this thing. Right? It's in my mind. Now I can examine it. But then, we're just learning a bit of mental carpentry here. That's not going to be particularly easy initially, because I may not have really done it before. I may not have looked at my own state of mind and say, yeah, what I'm feeling there is, let me see, what shall we call it? I think it's disappointment. It's a feeling of betrayal. Right? That's what it is. Where is it? Is it on the table? No. Where is it? It's in my mind. Right, now it requires self-honesty too, doesn't it? Because it's not easy for most of us, being prideful creatures that we are, to say, I'm feeling lust, hatred, frustration. It's not easy for us to say that, because we're all maintaining a self-image of being a nice but misunderstood person. This formula does not work. This formula definitely does not work. Let's just add up all the people that are on the planet all thinking the same thing. Right. So vichara means investigate. Look at that arising. We'll try to use a neutral word. It's an arising. It has arisen. Right. Now I can say, if I have sufficient courage and honesty, that is what I am feeling. I judge it and say, no, I don't like that feeling. No, that's not me. I don't really feel like that. Straight into denial. Straight into denial within milliseconds. It's a defense. It's a defense mechanism. But the defense mechanism is, okay, we understand that, I understand what defense mechanisms are about. About defense. What are we defending? Defending my sense of worth or whatever. So then that can become a blockage. It's not to say defense is always bad, but it can be a blockage if I'm defending myself against the truth about a state of mind. Some people it comes fairly naturally. Other people, it's really hard work. I mean, their mind just doesn't work that way. To go into defense also very quickly and automatically and denial can be a serious handicap in life, actually. You suffer a lot more from such an automatic response than by loosening up a bit. Okay, so examine the mind, label it without judgment. So don't say, okay, it's jealousy, but I don't like that. Don't say I don't like that. That is what it is. Don't attempt to explain where it comes from, because that will lead you in the wrong direction. The carpenter is not going to ask where this piece of wood came from. He's just going to get on with it. Right? So you don't have to say, Is it due to the fact that my father was very nasty to me when I was a boy? Oh, okay, yeah, maybe he was. Who cares? We are looking at what is in your head and investigating the quality of that.
Yeah, but if you do come from a place where that has happened, isn't it? How do you? It's one of the things I found so hard to understand about this part of the Buddhist teachings.
Mm-hmm.
This has happened to you. Forget about it. It doesn't matter. Just look at what it's causing and get over it.
Right, now remember what I said earlier. Don't start in that point.
Yeah.
See, start with the recognition, the acknowledgement of this is the state of mind that is in my that I'm holding. Right. That is not to say that that we're not shaped by the conditions and circumstances and things around us. So I'm not saying that, right? Right. It's just that if we start here, when we develop real wisdom, we can come back to that. I mean, you might see it in a completely different way and live with it, or even learn from it. Or even say, well, it's a shame that somebody used to treat me like that. What was he or she suffering from then? You see, you're starting now to think, well, what state of mind was that person in? Instead of building a sense of rejection or hatred, which is a suffering. That's the next thing I'm coming to, basically, is that if you look into any of these states, you see that you are suffering from them. But when you remember it, or when it's in your mind, it is now, because that's where now is. Do you see what I mean? You brought it back into the now. If you're and reliving the suffering now. You're suffering from it now in your mind, which is the only place you can suffer. Where else can you suffer? It happened. Yes, it happened.
Yeah.
But that happening is not here and now.
Yeah.
So you see, and that is why we're talking about. We need to let go of trying to explain. We can explain it. We can say it's because my father used to beat me up. Right? Okay, that terrible thing. Right. But then from that, where do I go? No, I'm now focusing on my father and certain incidents in my mind, and I feel pain every time it happens. Okay? It's not that that's false, it's just not the place to start. You see, it's about point of departure. We don't want to elaborate or proliferate, because once you start trying to explain and everything and judge, then it all becomes more complicated. All sorts of other factors will start coming in. The mind will start chattering to itself to justify itself. It wasn't really me, it was my father, etc. Said, oh, maybe it was. Maybe I wasn't a good boy. Maybe that's why I can't, then my self-worth starts suffering a bit. And then I'll change my mind again. Say, no, it wasn't me. No, it wasn't me. It was him. All this chatter going on in my head. Suffering. It's suffering, babe. Because we're going back to the hands in the mind, right? Trying to shape something here. Right. And obviously the carpenter or the potter, take the potter, is another good metaphor, has to be aware of the clay, puts his hands on the clay, shapes the clay, feels the wetness, right? Do you see what I mean? That's the equivalent of the awareness. The awareness that it is indeed that is what it is. I can't lie to myself. I can't block it out, which will probably do more harm in the long run. That is what it is. I may feel afraid of it. It may be too much for me to face, actually. In some cases it is. And in some cases I would say to people, okay, leave it alone. Don't want you to break down. But it depends. It depends. But for a lot of people, a lot of the time, this works. I know there will be cases in where people have had unbearable suffering. There was a case where a soldier with post-traumatic stress syndrome. I felt sorry for him. It was so difficult to help him, And I think he's near to suicide, really. Would mindfulness work? Yes, no, ugh. With great, great care and compassion. Because, he's on the edge. The one wrong move and pow. But most of us are not. Fortunately, most of us are not in that. We human beings are all carrying something or other. Me included. Who isn't? There isn't one that isn't carrying something. Most of it, I would say, is almost certainly manageable if we know how to go about it. It's just that we don't really have, the carpentry tools, if you like, to reshape. Come back to the process we're talking about. So, okay, that's what it is. It's disappointment. It's indignation. Right. Now, let go of trying to explain it. Let go of trying to justify or judge it. Right. It is what it is. You see, you can't change something into something else except by shaping it. I can't look at a piece of wood and by magic say, well, you're not actually that shape. You are actually that shape. I've just picked it up from outside. If I want to change it into something else, I've got to do some work. So I can't deny that it doesn't have the shape that it does. It does have the shape that it has. It arose by itself, which is now the fact that it arose by itself is a very important point, which leads us to the next stage. Because we overthink in our society, we suppose that when a negative state of mind pops up, that somehow that was my responsibility, that I decided to do that. That is not what happens. It just pops up. It arises of its own accord. This is a very important point. Because then we add another layer of beating ourselves up by saying, why am I always thinking such crap? Why am I always beating myself up? Why don't I stop thinking that? The fact is, you are not responsible for thinking that. It arises like a daffodil grows out of the ground. It's not following a set of instructions. It hasn't got a manual, like what do I do next? It didn't decide to grow. That's what daffodils do, right? That's what happens with feelings of dissatisfaction, anger, disappointment, etc. They pop up, they sprout. Now we know that there are conditions, many of them hidden conditions, just as there are hidden conditions behind the daffodil coming up. But you didn't think to yourself, I am now going to feel miserable about this or that. You just feel miserable. You get it? Now, this is a clue to something quite important. If it arose by itself, it's not yours. If you can really penetrate that statement, you'll see the glimmer of escape from our self-inflicted misery. It arose by itself. I didn't decide for it to arise. Then it's not me. It's not mine. Right? But I am suffering. So how is that possible? Something that's not mine, I'm suffering from it. It's a bit of a puzzle. There, isn't it? If it arose by itself, it'll also disappear by itself, which is what happens, of course. Because however miserable I feel, generally it does stop at some point. It gives me a little break, maybe for a while, even if I'm, quite badly depressed. It'll generally has its wave-like motion, and it'll maybe at least attenuate for a while, and before it flares up again. But for most of us, things just pop in and out for no particular reason. But its popping out is as inexplicable as it's popping in. Because I didn't think to myself, right, now it's going to pop out. You think that actually it's not going to pop out because you're thinking about it. So paradoxically, by thinking I'll get rid of it, you're actually inflaming it. That doesn't sound plausible, does it? But it's actually the case. You see, the cure for being obsessed about something is not to try to stop it. It's not to care about it. And you're not caring about whether it rises or whether it stops. And then, since it doesn't matter anymore, it'll just disappear of its own accord. But anyway, come back to that another day. Suffering. We've now noticed that it arose by itself, that it can't be willfully stopped. Right? So we're being realistic. This is why sometimes people say that Buddha's quite scientific, because he's going on what he has actually seen in his own mind, And then he's noticed that, look at that person suffering. Same damn thing that used to go on with me. Right? So it's quite scientific in a way, in the sense that it's empirical. It's based on his experience, and an experience that we all have, because we've already got it up to a point. It's just that we've got to now build on this a bit. It arose by itself. Now, if it arose by itself, then that suggests a certain amount of autonomy from me. That where is this actually coming from? But we don't want to intellectualize it. Because now, if I see that, I can say to myself, very important teaching of the Buddha is that is not me. That is not mine. I am not that. It is not in me, and I am not in it. Now, if you see that, right, with conviction, immediately this whatever it is, this lurking dark monster starts fading away. And we can finish it off by imagining to ourselves, gone, blown out. And that's the meaning of the word nibbana, blown out. The word nibbana is not, or nirvana, we think it's some sort of mystical place like heaven or somewhere. That's all. This is a huge misunderstanding. You see, if it were possible to be a master of blowing out, then you would be in nirvana, because you would never suffer. That sounds incredible, doesn't it? But we're going towards that. So it's just the less we suffer, the better. So even if you can subdue it a bit, like if you've got a bad headache, take some paracetamol, the headache might still be there, but it's less than it was, right? Well, the same with this carpentry technique is, at the very best, you might find that you're an extremely, awakened and peaceful person. On the other hand, you may be somewhere along on that path. When you know where to look, right, we know that now. We know how to look at it. We know how to examine it. We know how to acknowledge what it actually is, without any shyness about it, and without any explanation or judgment. And then see that it rose by itself, and it'll probably fall away by itself, but except I can't be bothered to wait. There's something I can do about this. I can get hold of it with my hands and say, you're not mine. There you go. It never was mine. It arose by itself, and it'll fall away by itself. It's not. See, try to remember the formula. That is not me. Now, when you think it's logical, actually, how can it be me if I am looking at it?
New Buddha Way lets go of East and West and starts afresh in the life we have now. For more information, visit www.newbuddhaway.org.